The pagan world saw the business of fertility, sex and the renewal of life as the vital connection between the gods and man. Christianity, in the early days, presented itself as anti-paganism. So being anti-fertility and anti-sex wasn't an accident. It was fundamental to Christianity. In the history of sex and love, St. Paul holds a very special place. He was both a Jew and a Roman citizen who grew up in a Greek city. He set out to interpret the message of the Jew Jesus to the Romano-Greek world, and a large part of that message, as he interpreted it, was that unmarried sex was not only shameful, but a sin. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is well for them to remain single, as I do. But if they have no self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. By putting control of sex at the heart of his religious message, Paul wrapped his own particular views on sexual behavior in the moral authority of the creator of the universe, and he made it stick. Where's the temple of Aphrodite now? There's hardly a stone of it left. Thank you, St. Paul. Before Christianity, there'd been no such thing as a thought or feeling that needed a priest's forgiveness. The idea of sinfulness just did not exist. By the 4th century AD, the church was claiming that if you confessed your sins to a priest, he could forgive them. The power that this conferred on the priest meant that from then on, they were going to control our attitudes to sex. Is it a bird? Is it a man? Well, not exactly. The Romans had never before thought of the phallus as something shameful. Images like the flying phallus were a kind of comic lucky horseshoe. But now the church had taken the Adam and Eve story, built up a profound sense of shame over private parts, married that to the Greek idea of pure love, and added the idea of sin. People all over the world had once believed that the sensual, sexual power of the gods made the world alive. Sexual love was literally divine. The church was determined to destroy that link, and along with it, paganism itself. And of course, the destruction of paganism meant that Christians would replace pagan priests at the center of power. The antipathy to sex of the early Christian authorities was so complete, it even extended to the whole idea of marriage.
Marriage is a moral crime, more dreadful than any punishment or any death.
Marriage is a crime against God, a prostitution of the members of Christ.
It was certainly a novel approach. Sexual love had once linked mankind to divinity, but now in Christianity it did the opposite. Sex cut you off from the love of God. The church imposed restrictions. Obviously only one partner, and not quite so obviously, only one position, man on top. No sex on holidays or fast days, or without your clothes on, or in church. Oh, and you mustn't enjoy it, of course. In the Middle Ages, the church dominated people's lives, just as it dominates this town of Montmorillon in central France. They didn't build churches like this just because they looked pretty. They were symbols of the power the church exercised over every aspect of society. Obviously, the church couldn't keep up its original opposition to marriage. It made more sense to take it over. But this wasn't that easy. You see, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, marriages weren't really religious ceremonies. They were more like business agreements between families, bringing their estates together. And small children would have their future partners chosen for them by their parents. So, in the 12th century, the Pope intervened in a rather surprising way. He played the incest card. He declared that marrying a relative was a sin, and not just a close relative, but any relative, to within 11 degrees of consanguinity. That means you couldn't marry anyone with whom you shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent without the church's permission, which of course came at a price. Everyone suddenly discovered there was about 250,000 people in their neighborhood whom they couldn't marry. And in a little town like Montmorillon, population maybe 500, that could be a bit of a problem. Chastity was still the preferred relationship between the sexes, even in marriage. And marriage itself still remained outside the church's official remit. It wasn't until the middle of the 16th century that the church finally made the marriage oath into a sacrament that had to be performed by a priest. It had taken over 1,500 years for the church to allow marriage into its own ritual. And maybe that wasn't so surprising, because Christianity was a man's business in a man's world, and women were regarded as lesser human beings. Faulty and inferior, females were merely the property of men, like farm animals. It may come as a bit of a surprise to learn that European attitudes towards women improved somewhat as a result of his encounter with Islam. Now, I know that nowadays we tend to think of traditional Islam as repressive towards women, but back in the 12th century, things looked a bit different. The Islamic tradition is that women should be concealed but honoured, and honouring women was something that was decidedly not part of the medieval church's agenda. The encounter between the Crusaders, who came from the rather brutal and sexually repressed lands of Christendom, with the exotic and romantic courts of Islam, changed Europe more than it changed the Middle East. One of the greatest sexual revolutions in history took place in this actual hall. For hundreds of years, the church had been reinforcing the stereotype of the sinful Eve, a woman as inferior and subordinate to men. But here in Poitiers, in France, there was one woman who thought this had gone on for long enough, at least as far as she was concerned. Her name was Eleanor. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was a very feisty lady. She was beautiful, charismatic, and sexy. But she was also married to the King of France, who wasn't. He was, well, Eleanor herself put it like this. She said, "I thought I'd married a man, but I find I've married a monk." They were not a happy couple. Eleanor clearly wanted more sex than Louis was offering, and she also wanted more power. And she realized that the two of them went together. She had a storming love affair with this chap, who was then the Duke of Normandy. His name was Henry. She had her marriage to Louis annulled, on the grounds of incest, of course, and married him. The following year, Henry made himself King of England and Eleanor Queen. And this is the palace the two of them built here in Poitiers. In it, Eleanor established an entirely new kind of court. She called it the Court of Love. Eleanor was trying to turn the tide of Christian anti-feminism. In her court, women were not just the equal of men, women ruled. They became unattainable objects of adoration, desired, fought over, longed for, but always just out of reach. And this suited Eleanor down to the ground. You see, she enjoyed surrounding herself with handsome young knights who flirted with her, but at a safe distance. After all, she was a married woman, and her husband Henry was not a pussycat. But that was the point. The courtly lover was always wooing a married woman, a woman who was somebody else's property, sometimes even his own overlord's. And in this way, the laws of courtly love challenged not just the church, but the feudal lordship itself. The language they spoke was descended from what the Romans spoke. It was the Romans' language, or Romance. And in the stories and poems that were recited in Eleanor's court, wars and heroic male battles with bad men and monsters were replaced with stories about love between men and women. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of literature, and we still call it by the same name, romance.